Hi class, thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation by Group 1 of the Eastern Time Zone. Our members are Jade Cummings, Jessica Hansen, Kelly McCloskey, Sydney Michelle, and I'm Janelle Upthegrove. Our behavior replication project targeted daily step frequency. Our goal was to incrementally increase the number of steps that each participant took each day. The behavioral definition of a step was any instance where one foot advances in front of the other alternatively, resulting in a forward or backward motion on any surface. This was important to clarify because the steps could be taken, for example, at home or work, on a sidewalk, the treadmill, or stairs, and we needed to be sure that all those settings would be covered by our behavioral definition. Our independent variable was self-monitoring, which is an antecedent intervention, and we used a single subject research design with changing criterion. In our next slide, Jade will give us a description of the study that we replicated.
In the study that we chose to replicate, there were 6 total participants. 5 of those participants were female and 1 was male. The average age range for the participants was 60 to 67 years of age. All of the participants were white. The procedure included 5 days of baseline. After those 5 days of baseline where the participants collected their daily steps, there were 2 intervention phases. Interventions were 5-day blocks where participants were asked to reach a step goal, which was 1,000 steps more than their previous block. All participants used a Fitbit tracker and an activity log to track their steps. The results of this study showed that 5 of the 6 participants increased their steps during intervention. The median improvement was 108.2%. Participants rated the intervention favorably. In the next slide, Janelle will discuss the literature review.
Thanks, Jade. It was important for everyone to understand the original method so that they have a grasp of what we tried to replicate. Replication of studies is an important attitude of science because repeated successes strengthen the reliability of a method, while replications that were unsuccessful allow researchers to investigate potential barriers or discover confounding issues. Moving forward, the following 2 slides will cover the literature review we conducted at the onset of our study replication. When you need to learn more about a topic in research, educational, or applied settings, it is important to conduct a literature review of reliable sources, such as peer-reviewed journals. Reading articles and studies related to the topic of interest will help to inform your decision-making process, highlight gaps in knowledge, and clarify any questions you may have. The first study we reviewed was by Markels, Taylor, Kitchen, Riccomini, Sheeler, and McNaughton. In this study, the authors evaluated the use of self-monitoring and tactile prompting to increase teachers' delivery of behavior-specific praise. The desired outcome was an increase in students' on-task behavior. This was relevant to our replication project because we also used self-monitoring strategies to increase the frequency of a behavior. Markels et al. Used a multiple baseline across participants' design, and the researchers were able to demonstrate a functional relationship between the intervention and the targeted behavior. Most importantly, data collection of the students' on-task behavior revealed that it increased from an average of 50% during baseline to 87% during intervention and 92% in maintenance. This was an awesome outcome with excellent social validity. Social validity is important to our studies because it demonstrates that we, as professionals, care about the impact of an outcome on the client's quality of life and the community as a whole. Social validity can be assessed via rating scales and provides a subjective measure of the client or community satisfaction with the treatment. Next, we reviewed an article about increasing daily step count by Stiano, Bale, Sia, Jarrell, Kaczmarzyk, Manser, Newton, and Tyson. This group design study was interesting because it compared two intervention groups to a control group. It targeted obese children between the ages of 8 and 17 living in the United States. The first intervention group used pedometers and self-monitoring only, while the second group used pedometers to self-monitor and were given changing criteria and weekly goals. The study concluded that setting weekly changing criteria and goals with self-monitoring was more effective at increasing steps per day than just self-monitoring alone. The third article we reviewed was a commentary by Husey on a study conducted by Finkelstein. The study concluded that the use of self-monitoring with pedometers, coupled with a constant criterion goal and incentives, was an effective treatment package for increasing daily steps in 251 children aged 6 to 12 years old. The study was conducted in Singapore. Husey's commentary on the study was that even though the steps goal was maintained at a moderate level of 8,000 per day, this was insufficient to result in weight loss in the children, according to their BMI measurements. She stated that while the study was effective, it could have been more socially valid by resulting in an actual improvement in the health of the children. This is an example of a study that raised questions about social validity for our group. The next article we digested was a comprehensive review of studies that have used the changing criterion design. This was important for us to read because we used a changing criterion design in our study. And the article by Klein, Houlihan, Vincent, and Panahan discussed many of the pitfalls and inaccuracies that are seen in changing criterion designs in the literature. They reported that out of 106 articles, using a total of 267 changing criterion design graphs, only about 25% of them demonstrated adequate experimental control. Lastly, we reviewed a study by Vetrovsky, Kupka, Dudek, Kutnova, Vetrovska, Kapek, and Bunk. This study was unique because it evaluated the intervention of pedometer-based self-monitoring with changing criterion weekly goals to improvement not in physical health, but in mental health. Rating scales were used for 23 sedentary participants to rate their mental health in the categories of depression, anxiety, and health-related quality of life. According to the rating scales following the self-monitoring intervention, symptoms of anxiety and depression decreased, while rating of physical and social functioning, mental health, vitality, and general health increased. The rating scale used was the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. Next, Sydney will talk to us about protocol comparison.
While the original study and the replicated study were very similar, there were a few minor differences. Due to the circumstances in all of the different locations of participants, we had to make a few changes. First, I will discuss the baseline. The original study used a Fitbit to track their steps, and then they recorded the data on a website called Motiv8. While we used Fitbits in the replicated study, we also had the option of using an Apple Watch because we all own different devices. The original study's baseline was collected within a 5-day screening window, and the data was recorded on the Motiv8 app. For every video submission of the results, they received $5, which would be motivating in itself. While that is an awesome incentive, it wasn't exactly doable for this project since we were all located in different areas. So for the replicated study, we decided to use a self-monitoring system, and then we moved to the next phase if there was a stable response. Now we're going to move on to the intervention. The original study consisted of 2 separate interventions, while the replicated study only had one. The original study also used Fitbit.com in order to record their steps for the day. The data was then transferred to Motiv8 on a secure website. Of the 2 interventions used, one of them used monetary reinforcement and the other did not. When the study was replicated, We took a screenshot of the graphs from either the Fitbit or Apple Watch and put them into a Word document. We also recorded our steps on the actual device and not a website. Now I'm going to discuss the implementation process. For our slide, we created a timeline that kind of lined out the outline of the intervention. The implementation process was fairly simple once we were all on the same page with everything. There were 5 days of treatment and we could have 2 off days. First, I'm going to talk about the baseline. We each recorded our steps, and then once we had 3 days with consistency, we were able to move on to the next phase. We remained in contact with one another throughout the whole process in case there were any questions. Next was phase 1, and that is when the intervention actually took place. Once 5 days of data had been collected, then we were able to figure out our changing criterion. Our device was with us at all times throughout the day and taken off before bed. In order to move on to the next phase, we had to reach our step goal for 3 out of the 5 days. If criteria was not met, then we looked at the 4th highest step count from the week before, or if you did meet the previous goal, then you could add 1,000 steps more to create your next goal. Once the week was over, it was determined what your criterion change would be, and you moved on to phase 2. For the purpose of the study, we did not make it to phase 2 due to being short on time. If we would have made it to that phase, it would have been completed exactly like phase 1, but with a different goal to match. Once we were done with the baseline and phases, we concluded the intervention. Then we uploaded our data to a Google Doc so that it was available for each of us to see. This allowed us to view each other's data and get a better idea of how each of us did with the intervention. We also used graphing, and a visual analysis was conducted to ensure that everyone was on the right track and that we had all of the information that was needed to get our results. Now that I am done talking about the implementation process, Jessica will now talk about the studies of IOA.
According to Cooper, inter-observer agreement is one of the most commonly used indicator of measurement quality in ABA. He also mentioned when IOA data is low, it helps determine the competence of new observers and detects observers' drift over the course of the study. When the IOA data is high, it increases the confidence that the target behavior was clearly defined and also confirms that change in data is due to change in behavior and not in the data collection. There are several different methods of calculating IOA data, each of which will provide a somewhat different view of the extent and also the nature of the agreement and disagreement between each observer. For this particular study, we used total count as our method. The observer, how we calculated our IOA data, inter-observer agreement is calculated to contribute the internal validity of a study. We use total count IOA data to calculate the IOA data during the replication of the study. Each participant used one fitness application as their primary observer and also downloaded an additional fitness application to serve as the secondary observer. Our primary observers was a Fitbit watch and also an Apple Watch. Our secondary observer, due to us all having an iPhone, was able to use the Health app. This application reporting the smaller number of steps was divided by the application reporting the larger number of steps. And then those two numbers then was multiplied by 100. This resulted in a percentage of the inter-observer agreement. At the end of the days on which IOA data was scheduled to be recorded, each participant took a screenshot of the steps count on both applications. The screenshots were then posted on to a group's log. Then another member calculated the IOA data. The group members then reported the IOA of each participant's screenshots to one another, which provided the team with an inter-rater agreement measurement. Now, Kelly will go over each of the individual graphs.
Thank you, Jessica. So like we mentioned before, this study used a changing criteria design. This means that baseline data is collected first, then each participant enters the intervention phase. Throughout the intervention period, data is analyzed, then a new appropriate criterion is set for an individual throughout treatment phases. For our study, we all collected baseline data, then after each participant displayed a stable baseline trend, he was able to move on to the intervention phase. In our study, each participant had 1 or 2 intervention phases. Each participant's graph looks a little different than one another since it was a changing criterion design that was based on our own personal data. But each participant's personal data determined what criterion goal would be set for that specific participant from phase to phase. So as you can see here, this first slide consisting of our participant graphs have Jade and Jessica's graphs. So let's look at Jade's graphs first. During baseline, Jade obtained a stable baseline count after 6 observation days and had an average step count of 6,450 steps. So since Jade's baseline average was 6,450, her phase 1 criteria would be her baseline average plus 1,000 steps as demonstrated in the original study. Therefore, Jade's phase 1 criteria was set to 7,450 steps for 3 out of 5 days. Jade was successful only 1 out of 6 days at meeting her step goal. Most of us did not have a chance to enter into phase 2 of our intervention due to short amount of time we had to complete our replication project. Since we had minimal time, Jade had 6 rather than 5 days for her phase 1 criteria intervention. However, if we had more time to complete the project, Jade's phase 2 criterion would have been set at 4,899 steps. That was the 4th highest step count on the days in her first phase block. Then the next graph we're going to look at is Jessica's graph on the right. So Jessica was able to obtain a stable baseline trend after 5 observation days. Jessica's average step count was 5,134 during baseline data. So her phase 1 criterion was set to 6,134 steps for 3 out of 5 days. By looking at the graph, you can see that Jess achieved her step goal 1 out of 5 days. The 4th highest step day for Jess's phase during phase 1 criteria block was 4,903. So Jess's new criterion for phase 2 was set at more than 4,903 steps for 3 out of 5 days. So on the next slide, we have graphs for Kelly, Sydney, and Janelle. So for my graph on the top, I had 3 stable data points during baseline. So I was able to move into the intervention phase 1. The average number of steps that I had during baseline was 8,526. My phase 1 criteria was set for 9,526 steps. I was only able to achieve that step goal 1 out of 5 days for phase 1. So I did not meet the criteria that was set for me in this phase. This meant that phase 2 would also now be set to my 4th highest step count day from phase 1. So therefore, my phase 2 criterion is set for achieving more than 5,320 steps for 3 out of 5 days. So below on the left-hand side, we can observe Sydney's graph. After Sydney achieved a stable baseline, she moved into her phase 1 and set her criteria to 7,404 steps, since that is 1,000 steps more than her average from the baseline phase. Sydney also achieved reaching her goal 1 out of 5 days during the observation period. Therefore, her phase 2 criterion was set to 3,153 steps, since that was her 4th highest step count from the phase 1 period. And last but not least, we have Janelle on the bottom right-hand side. We can see that Janelle obtained a stable baseline. She entered into phase 1. Her average step count for baseline was 8,506 steps. So her phase 1 criteria was set to 9,506 steps. Janelle did not meet her step criteria for any of the phase 1 intervention days. Janelle is the only person who was able to collect the beginning of phase 2 data. Since she had not reached her goal during phase 1, she had to set her phase 2 criterion at the 4th highest day from her phase 1 period, which was achieving more than 4,152 steps. We can see that even though Janelle was unable to complete the phase 2 period, the 3 days she was able to observe were above her step goal criteria that was set for phase 2. Therefore, if we had more time to enter into phase 3, Janelle would have been able to add 1,000 steps to her phase 2 step criterion to obtain her phase 3 step goal criterion. So this would have made her phase 3 criterion set at 5,152 steps, rather than taking the 4th highest step count from the prior phase. So now that we've looked at the participants' data individually, let's look at the results of the study as a whole. So after analyzing all the individual data, we are now able to discuss the results of the study. As Jade mentioned earlier in his presentation, the original study showed that this treatment was effective for 5 out of 6 participants, meaning they increased their daily step goal count. But however, our replicated study yields that the treatment was ineffective based on the data that we were able to collect. So our results showed that 0 out of 5 participants reached their phase 1 criterion that was set for step count. Therefore, each participant showed a decrease in daily step count average from baseline to intervention phase 1. 5 out of 5 members needed to set their phase 2 criterion to the 4th highest step count from the phase 1 period. 1 out of 5 participants was able to start intervention phase 2. Even though this phase 2 observation period was not complete, she met her step goal for the first 3 days of the 5-day observation period. This would have met the criterion that was set for the participant for phase 2. If this phase was completed, it would have been the only successful treatment phase across participants and phases. So now that we've discussed the data and the results, let's turn it over to Jessica to discuss our treatment fidelity procedures.
Thanks, Kelly. Treatment fidelity is important to have in studies for many different reasons. Treatment fidelity is a form of reliability measurement, and it ensures that everyone is on the same page with a complete understanding on how to run the intervention correctly. Creating the checklist allows us to see if there are any errors occurring early on. It can also make future replications easier to do because there should be no confusion. To ensure each participant replicated the study the same, a treatment fidelity checklist was created. These are the objectives we used for this study. The student reviewed behavior definition prior to the onset of the data collection. The student verified step collecting phone watch apps were turned on. Student verified step collecting app was starting at 0 for each day. Student took a screenshot of the day's count and graph. Student then exported a screenshot to the weekly log. Student completed the daily activity tracker log. All objectives by all participants were met during this study.
Limitations to our study included just a couple things. We were short on time this semester, so due to the short timeline of our semester, our group was unable to complete the study in its entirety. The original study also allowed the participants to upload screenshots of their steps onto a Motivate website where they were awarded reinforcement in the form of monetary compensation. In our replication, we did not use the website or a reinforcer, but we did upload screenshots to keep us accountable. Limitations are important to discuss in research in order to replicate studies and to avoid the same limitations study after study. When researchers discuss what they found to be a limitation, it allows future researchers to avoid these same issues. So, by us discussing that we did not have enough time, future researchers could make sure to allot extra time to complete the entire study. Expressing limitations also helps to add validity to the research process. Thank you for watching our presentation. We hope that you enjoyed this study replication as much as we did. The next slide will be a list of references that we found beneficial throughout our process of replicating the original study.